The morning sun painted the prairie grass golden as 23-year-old. Schoolteacher Rebecca Hayes adjusted her bonnet and looked out at the endless horizon. She had been traveling with the wagon train for 3 weeks now, heading west to Oregon Territory, where a teaching position waited for her in a small frontier town. The journey had been long but peaceful, filled with friendly conversations around evening campfires and the gentle rhythm of wagon wheels rolling over the vast plains. Rebecca shared her wagon with the elderly Mrs. Peterson, a kind widow moving west to live with her son and little Annie, an 8-year-old orphan being taken to relatives in Oregon. The child had grown attached to Rebecca during their journey, often sitting close to her during meals and asking endless questions about reading and writing. Rebecca found comfort in caring for Annie, as it reminded her of why she loved teaching so much. "Miss Rebecca, will you tell me another story tonight?" Annie asked, her small hand tugging at Rebecca's brown wool dress as they bumped along the dusty trail. "Of course, sweet child. Perhaps I'll tell you about the brave princess who learned to be strong all by herself," Rebecca replied, not knowing how prophetic her words would soon become. The wagon master, Thomas Mitchell, was a weathered man in his 50s who had led dozens of wagon trains safely across the frontier. He rode alongside the wagons on his sturdy horse, always watching the horizon for any signs of trouble. That morning he seemed more alert than usual, his hand resting on the rifle across his saddle. "Keep your eyes open today, folks," he called out to the travelers. "We're in territory where bandits sometimes cause problems. But don't worry too much. Most of them are cowards who only attack if they think they have an easy target." Rebecca felt a small chill run down her spine, but she pushed the worry away. They had traveled so far without any real danger, and Thomas had successfully guided many wagon trains before theirs. She turned her attention back to Annie, who was practicing writing letters on a small slate. As the sun climbed higher, the wagon train stopped for their midday rest near a small creek. Rebecca helped Mrs. Peterson down from the wagon and spread a blanket on the grass for their simple meal of bread, dried meat, and water from the creek. The other families did the same, creating a peaceful scene of pioneers taking a well-deserved break from their long journey. "Look at those pretty flowers, Miss Rebecca." Annie pointed to some wildflowers growing near the water. "Can we pick some for Mrs. Peterson?" Rebecca smiled and nodded, watching as the little girl ran toward the flowers. The other travelers were relaxing too, men tending to their horses, women preparing food, and children playing simple games in the grass. Everything felt safe and normal. But Thomas Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had noticed dust clouds on the horizon earlier that morning, and now he could see riders in the distance. His experienced eyes told him these weren't fellow travelers or friendly natives. The way they moved and how they stayed just out of clear sight made his stomach turn with worry. "Everyone, listen to me carefully," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the camp. "I want all of you to get back to your wagons right now. Something doesn't feel right." The peaceful mood changed instantly. Parents called for their children, and men reached for their weapons. Rebecca quickly gathered Annie and helped Mrs. Peterson toward their wagon, her heart beginning to race with fear. But it was too late. The attack came like thunder across the plains. 15 rough-looking men on horseback came charging toward the wagon train, whooping and firing their guns into the air. Their leader was a cruel-faced man with a black patch over his left eye and a scar running down his right cheek. This was Jake Morrison, known throughout the territory as Black Eye Morrison, leader of the most dangerous gang of bandits in the region. "Nobody move and nobody gets hurt," Morrison shouted as his men surrounded the terrified travelers. "We're not here for your money or your belongings. We want something much more valuable." Thomas Mitchell tried to reach for his rifle, but 2 bandits were already pointing their guns at him. "You let these people go," he said firmly, despite the danger. "They're just families trying to make a new life," Morrison laughed coldly. "Old man, you're in no position to make demands. We've been watching your little wagon train for 2 days, and we know exactly what we want." Rebecca pulled Annie close to her and tried to shield the child from what was happening. Around them, other women were crying and holding their children. The men in the wagon train were outnumbered and outgunned, with no way to fight back against the well-armed bandits. "Please," Rebecca found herself speaking up, her voice shaking but determined. "Take whatever you want, but leave the children alone." Morrison's cold eyes turned toward her, and his smile sent ice through her veins. Well, looks like we've got a brave one here, boys. That's exactly the kind of spirit our buyers are looking for." The horrible truth began to dawn on Rebecca and the other women. These bandits weren't interested in robbing them. They planned to steal the women and sell them to corrupt traders further west. It was a terrible crime that happened sometimes on the frontier, where law and order were still rare. Thomas Mitchell couldn't stand by and watch. Despite his age and the odds against him, he made a desperate move to protect the people he had promised to guide safely to Oregon. He dove for his rifle, hoping to at least give the families a chance to escape, but Morrison was faster. His gun fired once, and Thomas fell to the ground, his brave heart finally still. Several women screamed, and children began crying loudly. "That's what happens when people don't listen," Morrison said without any emotion in his voice. "Now, here's how this is going to work. We're taking the women. The rest of you can go on your way, and if you're smart, you won't try to follow us or cause any trouble." Rebecca felt like the world was spinning around her. In just a few minutes, their peaceful journey had turned into a nightmare. She thought about running, but Annie was clinging to her dress, and she couldn't abandon the little girl. Mrs. Peterson was too old, and weak to escape on foot. The bandits began separating the women from their families. Rebecca, Mrs. Peterson, Annie, and 3 other women from different wagons were forced onto horses with the bandits. The women's husbands and older sons were held at gunpoint, unable to help their loved ones without risking everyone's lives. "Mama!" Annie cried out as she was lifted onto a horse behind one of the bandits. "I'm right here, sweetheart," Rebecca called out, even though she was being forced onto another horse. "Be brave, just like the princes in the stories." As the bandits rode away with their captives, Rebecca looked back at the wagon train one last time. The men were already working to bury Thomas Mitchell, and she could see the pain and helplessness in their faces. She knew they would try to get help, but in this vast wilderness, help might be days or weeks away. The bandits rode hard for hours, taking their captives deeper into wild country where few people ever traveled. Rebecca's hands were tied and her body ached from the rough ride, but she kept her mind focused on staying strong for Annie and the other women. As the sun began to set, Morrison led them into a hidden canyon surrounded by tall red rocks. Rebecca could see that this wasn't the first time the bandits had used this place. There were signs of old campfires and areas where people had been kept against their will. "Welcome to your new home, ladies," Morrison announced as his men helped the women down from the horses. "Don't get too comfortable, though. In 3 days, we're taking you to a trading post where some very interested buyers are waiting." That night, as Rebecca sat with the other captives around a small fire, she realized that everything in her life had changed forever, but instead of giving up, she began to think. She had always been good at solving problems and finding ways to help others. Now, she needed to use those skills to find a way out of this terrible situation. She looked at Annie sleeping against her shoulder, and at Mrs. Peterson trying to stay brave despite her fear. These people were counting on her. Somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the canyon walls, was freedom. Rebecca didn't know how yet, but she was determined to find a way to reach it. The second night in the canyon felt darker and colder than the first. Rebecca sat with her back against the rough stone wall, little Annie curled up sleeping in her lap. The other women had finally dozed off after hours of quiet crying and whispered prayers. Only Rebecca remained awake, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She had spent the entire day watching the bandits, learning their routines and looking for weaknesses. Morrison kept 4 men on guard duty while the others slept, and they changed shifts every few hours. The horses were tied up on the far side of camp, and the only way out of the canyon was a narrow path that 2 guards always watched. "Tomorrow night we start moving toward the trading post," Morrison had announced earlier that evening, his cold voice making Rebecca's skin crawl. "I've got buyers lined up who pay good money for women like you." Teachers, they tell me, are especially valuable out here where education is rare. Rebecca had forced herself to stay calm when he said this, but inside her heart was pounding with fear. She knew that once they reached that trading post, any chance of rescue would disappear forever. If she was going to act, it had to be soon. Mrs. Peterson stirred beside her, and Rebecca reached over to gently pat the older woman's shoulder. "Try to rest," she whispered. "Tomorrow will be another difficult day. I keep thinking about my son," Mrs. Peterson whispered back, tears visible in her eyes even in the dim firelight. "He's waiting for me in Oregon. He doesn't even know what's happened." "We're going to see him again," Rebecca said firmly, though she wasn't sure how. "I promise you that." The hours crawled by slowly. Rebecca listened to the sounds of the night, owls calling in the distance, the wind whistling through the canyon walls, and the soft snoring of sleeping bandits. She was just beginning to feel drowsy herself when she heard something different. At first, it was so faint she thought she might be imagining it. But then she heard it again, a sound like a bird call, but not quite right. It was coming from somewhere up on the canyon rim, high above their camp. One of the guards heard it too. He stood up and looked around nervously, his hand moving to his gun. "Did you hear that, Pete?" he whispered to the other guard. "Hear what?" Pete replied, but he was also looking up at the dark walls of the canyon. The sound came again, and this time Rebecca was sure it wasn't a bird. It was some kind of signal, and it was moving around the rim of the canyon. Her heart began to beat faster, but now it was with hope instead of fear. Then everything happened at once. War cries echoed off the canyon walls as shadows seemed to come alive everywhere. Warriors appeared as if by magic, climbing down ropes and leaping from rock to rock with incredible skill. The bandits who had been sleeping jumped up in confusion, reaching for their weapons, but they were already surrounded. "Attack! We're under! Attack!" Morrison shouted, firing his gun wildly into the darkness. Rebecca grabbed Annie and pulled her close, shielding the child's eyes from the chaos around them. The other women huddled together as the battle raged across the camp. These weren't ordinary fighters. They moved like ghosts in the night, striking fast and disappearing before the bandits could fight back. In the flickering light of the campfire, Rebecca caught glimpses of the warriors. They were Lakota, she realized, with painted faces and traditional weapons alongside modern guns they had taken from fallen enemies. Their leader was a young man who fought with incredible courage and skill, always staying between the bandits and the captive women. The battle was fierce but short. The bandits had been caught completely off guard, and many of them were still half asleep when the attack began. Some tried to run toward the horses, but warriors were waiting for them there too. Others attempted to use the women as shields, but the Lakota fighters were too smart and too quick for such desperate tactics. Morrison himself made a final, terrible attempt to save his own life. He grabbed a burning piece of wood from the fire and ran toward Rebecca and Annie, his scarred face twisted with rage. "If I'm going down, I'm taking some of you with me," he screamed. Rebecca didn't think. She just acted. She pushed Annie behind her and stood up to face Morrison, even though she had no weapon and no way to defend herself. She wouldn't let him hurt the child, no matter what happened to her. But before Morrison could reach them, the Lakota leader appeared between them like a guardian spirit. He was tall and strong, with long black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Without hesitation, he struck Morrison down, saving Rebecca and Annie from certain harm. For a moment, Rebecca found herself looking directly into the warrior's dark eyes. She expected to see the same cruelty she had seen in Morrison's face, but instead she saw something completely different. There was strength there, yes, and the fierce pride of a fighter, but also honor and a kind of gentleness that surprised her. The warrior's name was Lakota, which meant friend to all in his language, though Rebecca didn't know this yet. He had been leading a small war party against the bandits who had been terrorizing both white settlers and native tribes in the area. His original plan had been simple: drive off or destroy the bandits and take any weapons or supplies they could use. He hadn't expected to find captive women and a child. As the smoke from the battle began to clear, Lakota found himself in a difficult position. His warriors had won a complete victory. Most of the bandits were dead or had fled into the night, and the few survivors would never bother anyone again. But now he had to decide what to do with the rescued captives. His people had little reason to trust white settlers. Too many times, they had tried to help whites only to be repaid with broken promises and violence. Many of his own family members had been killed by soldiers or settlers who saw all natives as enemies, but as Dakota looked at Rebecca, still protecting the little girl even though the danger had passed, he felt something stir in his heart that he hadn't expected. This woman had shown incredible courage, facing down Morrison with nothing but her own determination to protect a child. That kind of bravery deserved respect, no matter what color her skin was. "You are safe now," he said in careful English. His voice deep but gentle. Rebecca was surprised that he could speak her language. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice shaking with relief and exhaustion. "You saved our lives." Dakota nodded, but his expression remained serious. Behind him, his warriors were gathering weapons and supplies from the bandit camp. Some of them were looking at the white women with suspicion and uncertainty. "What happens to us now?" Rebecca asked, still holding Annie close. This was the question Dakota had been dreading. According to the ways of his people, captives taken in battle belonged to the tribe, to be adopted or traded as the chief decided. But these women hadn't been captured by his warriors, they had been rescued. That made the situation much more complicated. "You will come with us," Dakota said finally. "My chief will decide what is to be done." Rebecca felt a new kind of fear creep into her heart. She had been saved from the bandits, but what would happen to them among the Lakota? Stories she had heard about native tribes were usually frightening tales, told to scare children or justify violence against them. But looking at Dakota, she realized that many of those stories might not be true. As the warriors prepared to leave the canyon, Dakota made sure that Rebecca and the other women were given water and blankets. He helped Mrs. Peterson onto one of the captured horses, being careful with her because he could see she was weak and frightened when he helped Rebecca mount her horse. Their hands touched briefly, and she felt a strange sense of safety she hadn't expected. This man who had appeared like a warrior from the old stories had risked his own life to save hers. Whatever happened next, she owed him a debt she could never repay. As they rode out of the canyon under the stars, Rebecca looked back one last time at the place where her nightmare had begun. Now she was heading into the unknown again, but this time she wasn't a prisoner. She was under the protection of a man whose courage had given her hope when all seemed lost. The long journey to Dakota's village would test them both in ways they couldn't imagine, but for now, Rebecca felt something she hadn't felt since the attack on the wagon train. The possibility that she might actually survive this terrible adventure and find her way to freedom. The Lakota village appeared before them like something from a dream as the morning sun painted the sky pink and gold. Rebecca had never seen anything like it. Dozens of large buffalo hide tipis arranged in careful circles, with horses grazing peacefully nearby and smoke rising from cooking fires. Children were playing games in the grass, while women prepared the morning meal and men checked their weapons and talked quietly together. But as soon as the villagers saw Dakota's war party approaching with white captives, the peaceful morning scene changed completely. Women quickly gathered their children and pulled them away from the newcomers. Men reached for their weapons and formed a protective line. The looks on their faces made Rebecca's heart sink. These people saw her and the other rescued women as enemies, not as people who needed help. "Stay close to me," Dakota said quietly to Rebecca as they rode into the village. "Some of my people have been hurt badly by whites. They will need time to trust you." Rebecca nodded, keeping Annie pressed close against her as hostile eyes followed their every move. She could hear angry voices speaking in Lakota, and even though she couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear enough. Many of these people didn't want them here. Chief Running Bear emerged from the largest tipi in the center of the village. He was an older man with gray streaks in his long black hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of both wisdom and sorrow. His presence commanded immediate respect from everyone in the village, and even the angriest voices fell silent when he raised his hand. Dakota dismounted and approached his chief with great respect, speaking rapidly in Lakota while gesturing toward Rebecca and the other women. The conversation went on for several minutes, with other warriors and village elders joining in. Rebecca could tell they were arguing about what to do with the rescued captives. Finally, Chief Running Bear walked over to where Rebecca sat on her horse, still holding Annie. He studied her face carefully, as if trying to read her thoughts and intentions. When he spoke, his English was better than Dakota's, but still careful and formal. "White woman, you have been saved from bad men by my warriors. This gives you a debt to our people. But you are also not welcome here by many of my tribe who have lost family to your kind. I will give you and the others a place to stay while we decide what is to be done. Do not try to leave without permission, and do not cause trouble in our village." "Thank you, Chief Running Bear," Rebecca replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. "We're grateful for your protection, and we don't want to cause any problems for your people." The chief nodded slightly, perhaps surprised by her respectful tone. He gave orders in Lakota, and several women came forward reluctantly to help the rescued captives down from their horses. Rebecca noticed that these women kept their distance and wouldn't look directly at her face. They were given a small tipi on the edge of the village, far from the central area where the important families lived. It was clear this was meant to keep them separated from the rest of the community. The tipi was old and had some holes that let in cold air, but it was still better than sleeping under the stars or being prisoners of the bandits. That first day was the hardest. Rebecca and the other women sat in their tipi, not knowing what to do or where they were allowed to go. Annie was frightened and kept asking when they could go home, but Rebecca didn't know how to answer her questions. Mrs. Peterson was getting weaker, and Rebecca worried that the stress and difficult travel were too much for the elderly woman's health. "What's going to happen to us?" asked Helen, one of the other rescued women. She had 3 young children back with the wagon train and was desperate to return to them. "I don't know," Rebecca admitted, "but Chief Running Bear seems like an honorable man. I think if we show respect for their ways and try to be helpful, maybe they'll let us go." On the second day, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She had noticed that many people in the village were coughing and seemed sick with some kind of illness. Having helped care for students and families back in her hometown, she had learned basic nursing skills from the local doctor. When she saw a young mother struggling to care for her fevering baby outside a nearby tipi, Rebecca couldn't just sit and watch. Despite knowing she might get in trouble, she approached the woman and used gestures to show that she wanted to help. The mother was suspicious at first, pulling her baby away from Rebecca. But when the child's fever got worse and nothing the mother tried seemed to work, desperation overcame fear. She allowed Rebecca to examine the baby and try some of the simple remedies she knew. Rebecca wet a cloth with cool water and gently placed it on the baby's forehead, then showed the mother how to keep the child's body temperature down. She also demonstrated a breathing technique that could help clear the baby's congested chest. Within a few hours, the child's fever broke and he began breathing more easily. Word spread quickly through the village about what Rebecca had done. Soon, other mothers were bringing their sick children to her, and she found herself working alongside Ayana, the village's medicine woman. Ayana was an elderly woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who had been healing people for many decades. At first, Ayana watched Rebecca suspiciously, unsure whether to trust this white woman with her people's health. But as she saw Rebecca's genuine care for the patients and her willingness to learn, the medicine woman began to warm up to her. "You have good hands for healing," Ayana said one evening as they finished treating a young boy with a broken arm. "Where did you learn these things?" Rebecca tried to explain using the few Lakota words she had picked up and many hand gestures. She told Ayana about helping the doctor in her hometown and caring for 6 students at the school where she taught. The medicine woman listened carefully and began teaching Rebecca some basic Lakota words for different parts of the body and healing plants. Dakota watched all of this from a distance, and his respect for Rebecca grew with each passing day. He had seen many white people who claimed to be good but showed their true nature when they thought no one was watching. But Rebecca's kindness seemed genuine. She worked hard to help people who had every reason to distrust her, and she never asked For anything in return, one evening, as Rebecca was walking back to her tipi after a long day of helping with the sick, Dakota approached her. In the weeks since the rescue, they had barely spoken, but she had often caught him watching her with those thoughtful, dark eyes. "The people are beginning to trust you," he said simply. "I hope so," Rebecca replied. "I just want to help while we're here. Your people have been kinder to us than they had any reason to be." "Not all whites would see it that way," Dakota observed. "Many would complain about the food or the accommodations or demand to be taken back to their own people immediately." Rebecca looked toward the tipi where Annie and Mrs. Peterson were resting. The little girl was finally sleeping peacefully, no longer crying herself to sleep every night, and Mrs. Peterson's health was slowly improving thanks to Ayana's medicines and the stability of village life. "We're alive because of you," she said softly. "How could I complain about anything when you risked your life to save us from those terrible men?" Something changed in Dakota's expression when she said this. The formal distance he had maintained began to soften, and for the first time, Rebecca saw him not just as a warrior or protector, but as a person with his own thoughts and feelings. "My sister died of fever 2 winters ago," he said quietly. "I watched her suffer, and there was nothing I could do to help her. When I see you healing the children in our village, I think about how much I wish someone like you had been there for her." Rebecca felt tears come to her eyes. She had wondered why Dakota seemed so moved by her work with the sick children, and now she understood. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. "Losing someone you love is the hardest thing in the world." They stood together in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. Around them, the village was settling down for the night, with families gathering in their tipis and the sound of quiet conversations drifting on the evening breeze. For the first time since the attack on the wagon train, Rebecca felt something like peace. She was still far from the life she had planned, still uncertain about the future, but she was beginning to understand that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places. As she finally headed back to her tipi, she didn't notice Dakota watching her go with a new expression in his eyes, one that spoke of growing feelings he wasn't sure he should allow himself to have. 3 months had passed since Rebecca arrived at the Lakota village, and her life had taken on a rhythm she never could have imagined. Each morning, she would help Ayana prepare medicines from wild plants and roots. In the afternoons, she taught some of the village children basic reading and writing using charcoal and pieces of bark. And in the evenings, she would often find herself walking with Dakota. As he told her stories about his people's history and traditions, the walls of suspicion that had once surrounded her were slowly crumbling. Mothers who had once pulled their children away now brought them to her when they were sick. Young women in the village had begun teaching her how to prepare traditional foods and make clothing from buffalo hide. Even some of the warriors who had been most opposed to her presence now nodded respectfully when they passed her on the village paths, but it was her growing relationship with Dakota that brought her the most joy and the most worry. They had never spoken directly about their feelings for each other, but everyone in the village could see what was happening. The way he looked at her when she was working with the children, the way she smiled when he approached. The long conversations they shared by the river as the sun set behind the mountains. Annie had grown to love village life and had learned to speak Lakota almost as well as English. She played with the other children and had been unofficially adopted by several of the village mothers who doted on her like she was their own daughter. Mrs. Peterson, too, had found peace in the village. Her health had improved greatly under Ayana's care, and she spent her days helping with cooking and telling stories to the elderly members of the tribe. Rebecca had begun to think that maybe, just maybe, she had found a new home in this unexpected place. She had even started learning to speak Lakota more fluently, and Dakota had been teaching her about the spiritual beliefs and customs of his people. She felt like she was becoming part of something larger than herself, but one bright morning in early autumn, everything changed. Rebecca was gathering herbs with Ayana when they heard the sound of many horses approaching the village. It wasn't the usual sound of hunting parties returning or traders arriving. This was different, organized, disciplined, and threatening. Soldiers, Ayana said grimly. Recognizing the sound immediately, they hurried back to the village to find everyone in a state of controlled panic. Chief Running Bear was already speaking with his war council while women gathered their children and prepared for possible conflict. Rebecca could see about 30 U.S. cavalry soldiers arranged in formation just outside the village, their blue uniforms bright against the prairie grass. The soldier leading them was a stern-faced man with a thick mustache and cold gray eyes. Captain James Reynolds had been hunting Rebecca and the other kidnapped women for months, following rumors and reports from settlers who claimed to have seen white captives among the various native tribes in the region. "I am Captain Reynolds, of the United States Army," he announced in a loud voice that carried across the village. "We have reports that you are holding white women and children against their will. I demand that you release them immediately." Chief Running Bear stepped forward, his dignity intact despite the tension of the moment. "Captain Reynolds, the women you seek came to us seeking protection from bandits who had captured them. They are free to leave whenever they choose." "But, not what we've heard," Reynolds replied coldly. "According to the survivors from their wagon train, these women were taken by Indians after their rescue from bandits. We're here to bring them back to civilization where they belong." Rebecca felt her heart racing as she realized what was happening. The cavalry had come to rescue her, but she no longer wanted to be rescued. The thought of leaving Lakota and the village life she had grown to love filled her with panic. She looked around and saw Lakota standing with the other warriors, his hand resting on his tomahawk. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. One wrong move from either side could turn this confrontation into a deadly battle. "I want to speak to the women myself," Captain Reynolds declared. "Bring them forward so they can tell me in their own words that they want to stay here." Chief Running Bear nodded slowly and gestured for Rebecca and the other women to come forward. As she walked toward the center of the village, Rebecca could feel hundreds of eyes watching her. The choice she made in the next few minutes would determine not just her own future, but possibly the fate of everyone in the village. Captain Reynolds looked at her with a mixture of relief and disgust. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Reynolds. We've been searching for you and the other women for months. I'm here to take you back to safety." "Captain," Rebecca said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but we are safe here. These people saved our lives and have treated us with nothing but kindness." Reynolds' expression darkened. "I think you may be suffering from what we call captivity syndrome. It's common for prisoners to develop confused feelings about their captors. But don't worry, once we get you back to proper society, you'll remember who you really are." Rebecca felt anger rising in her chest. "Captain Reynolds, I know exactly who I am. I'm a teacher who has found a new purpose helping people who need medical care and education. I'm not confused and I'm not a prisoner. These savages have obviously brainwashed you," Reynolds said harshly. "No civilized white woman would choose to live like this if she was thinking clearly." The word savages hit the assembled villagers like a physical blow. Rebecca could see rage flashing in the eyes of the warriors, and even some of the women looked ready to fight. Lakota took a step forward, his face set in hard lines. "Captain," Rebecca said quickly, trying to prevent violence, "please don't use that word. These are good people who have their own rich culture and traditions. They've shown me more kindness than I ever received in some civilized places." "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist that you come with us," Reynolds said firmly. "It's for your own good, whether you realize it or not." It was then that Chaitan, one of the younger warriors who had never fully accepted the white women's presence, stepped forward and spoke in rapid Lakota to Chief Running Bear. Rebecca couldn't understand all the words, but she caught enough to realize he was suggesting they use the women as leverage against the soldiers. Lakota immediately argued back, his voice sharp with anger. Rebecca could see that the village was splitting into two groups, those who wanted to let the women choose for themselves, and those who saw this as an opportunity to gain power over the white soldiers. The argument grew more heated, with voices rising on both sides. Captain Reynolds was growing impatient and suspicious as he watched the heated discussion he couldn't understand. "What are they saying?" he demanded of Rebecca. Are they planning to attack us? Rebecca found herself in an impossible position. She was caught between two worlds that seemed determined to fight each other, and her words could tip the balance toward either peace or violence. Captain Reynolds, she said slowly, what if I could prove to you that we're here by choice? What? If I could help you understand that this doesn't have to end in conflict? The only thing I understand is that you're American citizens being held by hostile Indians, Reynolds replied. I have my orders and I intend to carry them out. It was then that Rebecca made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward, positioning herself directly between the soldiers and the villagers. Then you're going to have to go through me? She said with quiet determination. Because I won't let you hurt these people, and I won't let them hurt you. Either there has to be another way. Dakota stared at her in amazement. Here was this white woman, barely 5 feet tall, standing up to 30 armed soldiers and a village full of warriors. Trying to protect both sides from each other, Captain Reynolds was equally stunned. Ma'am, you're making a very serious mistake. Step aside, or I'll have you arrested for interfering with a military operation. Then arrest me, Rebecca said simply. But I won't move until we find a peaceful solution to this problem. The standoff continued as the sun climbed higher in the sky. On one side stood the cavalry, convinced they were rescuing helpless captives. On the other side stood the Lakota, torn between protecting their village and respecting their guests' wishes. And in the middle stood Rebecca, a schoolteacher who had found the courage to face down both sides in the name of peace. Little did she know that her words and actions in the next few hours would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone she had come to love in her new home. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours as Rebecca stood between the two groups, her heart pounding but her feet planted firmly on the ground. Captain Reynolds stared at her with growing frustration while behind her she could hear a quiet murmur of voices as the villagers watched this unprecedented scene unfold. Finally, it was Chief Running Bear who broke the silence. The wise old leader stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Rebecca's shoulder. White daughter, he said in English so everyone could understand, your courage honors both our peoples. Step back now and let me speak. Rebecca looked into his kind eyes and saw something there that gave her hope. She nodded and moved slightly to the side, but remained close enough to intervene if the situation turned dangerous. Chief Running Bear faced Captain Reynolds with the dignity that had made him a respected leader for over 20 years. Captain Reynolds, you speak of rescuing these women, but have you asked them what they wish to be rescued from? They are not prisoners here. They work alongside our people because they choose to. They eat at our fires because they wish to share our food. They sleep safely in their lodge because we protect them as we would our own family. That's exactly what a captor would say, Reynolds replied skeptically. Of course you're going to claim they're here willingly, but I've seen what happens to white women who spend too long among your kind. They forget who they are and where they belong. Rebecca felt anger flare up again at his words, but before she could speak, Dakota stepped forward. She had never seen him look more serious or more determined. Captain, Dakota said in careful English, you say you want to know what these women truly desire. Then let me tell you what I propose. Give us 3 days to show you how they live among us. See for yourself whether they are prisoners or free people. If after 3 days you still believe they are being held against their will, we will not stop you from taking them. Captain Reynolds looked suspicious. And what guarantee do I have that this isn't some kind of trap? How do I know you won't attack us in our sleep or disappear with the women? Because I give you my word as a chief of the Lakota people, Chief Running Bear said solemnly. And if that is not enough, I will send my own son to stay in your camp as surety for our good faith. This proposal surprised everyone, including Reynolds. In frontier negotiations, such an exchange of hostages was considered a sacred bond. If the Lakota broke their word, the captain would have the chief's son as a prisoner. It was a risk no leader would take lightly. Rebecca watched the captain's face as he considered the offer. She could see him weighing his options. He could attack the village and probably win, but he would lose soldiers and might not be able to prove the women had been willing captives. On the other hand, 3 days would give him time to observe the situation and make a more informed decision. "Very well," Reynolds said finally. 3 days. "But I want my men to have access to the women whenever they choose, and I want to see every part of how they live." "Agreed," Chief Running Bear nodded. "You will see everything." Over the next 3 days, something remarkable happened. Captain Reynolds had come expecting to find evidence of cruelty and coercion. Instead, he watched Rebecca work alongside Ayanna, treating sick children with gentle skill and obvious compassion. He saw her teaching young Lakota children to read and write, their faces bright with excitement as they learned new skills. He observed Mrs. Peterson, helping prepare meals and telling stories to the village elders, clearly content and respected among her new friends. He watched little Annie playing games with the native children, switching effortlessly between English and Lakota as she laughed and ran through the village. Most surprising of all, he witnessed the growing relationship between Rebecca and Dakota. It wasn't the fearful submission of a captive to her captor that he had expected to see. Instead, it was clearly a deep affection between two people who respected and cared for each other. On the second evening, as Reynolds sat by the fire with some of his soldiers, Rebecca approached him with a steaming bowl of stew and fresh bread. "Captain," she said quietly, "may I speak with you privately?" He nodded and followed her away from the fire to a quiet spot near the river. The moon was full, casting silver light on the water and making everything look peaceful and beautiful. "Captain Reynolds," Rebecca began, "I know this situation is difficult for you to understand. A few months ago, I wouldn't have understood it either. I was a school teacher with a simple life, planning to marry a banker back in Ohio and live the life everyone expected me to live. Then why throw all that away for this?" Reynolds asked, genuinely curious now rather than just suspicious. Rebecca looked back toward the village, where she could see Dakota talking with some of the other warriors around the central fire. "Because here I've found something I never had before. I've found a purpose that goes beyond just existing. These people need medical care, education, and someone who can help them understand the changing world around them. And in return, they've given me a kind of acceptance and love I never knew was possible." "But what about your own people, your own culture? Don't you miss the life you used to have?" "Of course I do, sometimes," Rebecca admitted. "I miss certain comforts and familiar things. But, Captain, I've learned that home isn't a place or a way of living. Home is where you feel like you belong, where you can make a difference, and where you're loved for who you truly are." Captain Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. "And this Indian, Dakota, you truly care for him?" Rebecca felt her cheeks warm, but she met his eyes directly. "Yes, Captain, I love him, and he loves me. Not because I'm his captive or because I have no choice, but because we found something together that neither of us expected to find." On the third day, Captain Reynolds made his decision. He gathered all the rescued women together and spoke to each of them individually, asking them clearly and directly what they wanted to do. Mrs. Peterson chose to stay in the village, saying that the grandchildren she had gained there meant more to her than the son she had been traveling to see in Oregon. Helen, one of the other rescued women, decided to return with the soldiers, to try to reunite with her own children from the wagon train. Annie, when asked, looked at Rebecca with wide eyes and said simply, "I want to stay with Miss Rebecca and all my new friends." When it came to Rebecca's turn, Captain Reynolds looked at her seriously. "Ma'am, I have to ask you one more time. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Once I leave here, there may not be another chance for you to return to white society." Rebecca looked around at the village that had become her home. She saw Ayanna grinding herbs for medicine, children playing games she had taught them, and warriors who now nodded to her with respect. Most importantly, she saw Dakota watching her with eyes full of love and hope. "Captain Reynolds," she said with absolute certainty, "I am exactly where I belong." The captain nodded slowly. "Then I wish you well, ma'am. I can't say I understand your choice, but I can see that it truly is your choice to make." That evening, as the soldiers prepared to leave the next morning, Chief Running Bear called for a special ceremony. He announced that Rebecca had proven herself to be a true friend to the Lakota people, and that if she wished to stay permanently, she would be welcomed as a full member of the tribe. Lakota stepped forward then, his heart in his eyes as he looked at Rebecca. "Rebecca," he said, using her English name because he wanted everyone to understand his words, "will you consent to become my wife? Will you let me spend the rest of my life protecting and loving you?" Rebecca felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "yes, I will marry you." The wedding ceremony 3 weeks later was unlike anything anyone in the village had ever seen. It blended traditions from both cultures. Rebecca wore a beautiful dress made from white deerskin and decorated with beads and quill work by the women of the village, while Lakota wore his finest warrior regalia. Chief Running Bear performed the Lakota portions of the ceremony, while Rebecca recited vows she had written herself that honored both her Christian upbringing and her new spiritual beliefs, Captain Reynolds, who had delayed his departure to witness the wedding, found himself surprisingly moved by the ceremony. He had come expecting to rescue a helpless captive, but instead he had watched a brave woman choose love over convention and find a happiness he wasn't sure he had ever seen before. As the celebration continued late into the night, Rebecca danced with her new husband under the stars, surrounded by people who had become her family. Annie ran between the dancers, laughing with pure joy, while Mrs. Peterson sat with the elders, sharing stories and wisdom with her new friends. Rebecca thought about the school teacher she had been just a few months ago, scared, conventional, living a life planned out by others. That woman seemed like a stranger now. The bandits who had captured her had thought they were taking away her freedom, but instead they had led her to the greatest freedom of all, the freedom to choose her own path and find love in the most unexpected place. In Lakota's arms, surrounded by her new family, Rebecca finally understood what it meant to be truly free. Freedom wasn't about being